Roughly 56,000 years ago, during the Upper Paleolithic, Europe was not a continent of nations nor cities, yet it was a fractured ice world. The last glacial period was nearing its peak. Much of the northern landscape was locked beneath two-man-thick ice sheets, and Doggerland was still above sea level. Further south, glaciers gave way to steppe tundra, barren treeless expanses swept by sustained winds exceeding 60 km, where even in summer temperatures often failed to rise above freezing. Average winter temperatures dropped below 200 C in many regions. Precipitation came mostly as snow. Rivers, trees were rare across vast stretches. The dominant colors were white, gray, and brown, the palette of survival. The megafauna that roamed this world had evolved accordingly. Woolly mammoths, reindeer, cave lions, steppe bison, all layered in thick hides and muscle, built to outlast hunger and frost. Humans did the same. They had already been here for quite some time. The Neanderthals had called Europe home for at least 300,000 years. They were specialists in cold survival, compact, powerful, and deeply adapted to these harsh conditions. They hunted in coordinated groups, sheltered in caves, and knew the terrain intimately. But now the ice held a second kind of human, a stranger coming from parts of the world unknown to Neanderthal. Their arrival marks a quiet inflection point in the archaeological record. A new set of tools, new settlement patterns, and subtly different bones. They're dated to around 56,800 years ago, first appearing in South France, but soon spreading across the continent. We call them European early modern humans or Cro-Magnons, after the rock shelter where their remains were first discovered in 1868. Their bones were buried beneath thick layers of Ice Age sediment, alongside stone tools, ornaments, and other remnants of a vanished world. At first glance, they resembled us so much so that early scientists struggled to classify them. But within the layers of their anatomy and the layers of ice around them, something was different. They did not evolve here, they came in from elsewhere. And in a landscape already claimed by another human species, their arrival raised a silent, inevitable question. What happens when two apex predators meet on a continent that can barely sustain one? The answer would not come quickly, but the evidence frozen in Earth suggests that the Ice Age had just found its most dangerous inhabitant. The earliest Cro-Magnon fossils between 43 and 56,800 years ago are unlike any other early Homo sapiens, not just in tools or art, but all the way to their bones. These were not fragile survivors scraping by at the margins like the environment could suggest it would happen. They were built like absolute units. Their skeletons tell the story. Males regularly stood over 1.7559 close to today's standards, with some individuals reaching 188 to 19162 to C3. They were towering over their Neanderthal contemporaries, whose average height hovered around 1.65 N55. Even the women were especially tall for their time, averaging 1.6063 M554, comparing to many present-day global averages. But it wasn't just about height. Cro-Magnon was dense. Their long bones were significantly thicker, broader, and heavier than modern humans, indicating extreme physical robustness. In particular, their clavicles, collarbones, were astonishing, some measuring over 19 cm, about 25% longer than the modern average. This anatomical feature gave them exceptional leverage for powerful arm movements, ideal for spear thrusts, close combat, and repeated heavy labor. Their limb proportions, particularly the length and strength of the femur and humerus, suggest a body optimized for sustained physical output and endurance hunting. Researchers estimate that Cro-Magnon males of equivalent height to modern humans would have weighed 20% more, primarily in lean muscle mass, with large muscle attachments evident across their skeletons. Simply put, they were able to leverage much more force than we do for similarly sized people. They just weren't built like us, but closer to modern strong men. This wasn't an evolutionary accident. It was an adaptation under pressure. In the Ice Age environment, survival wasn't just about being smart. If you couldn't apply the ideas, you would end up dead faster than you'd even realize. So people evolved to become unbreakable. The cold stressed bones and joints. Food was hard-won and often massive bison or ox, reindeer and mammoth. Injuries were constant, and healing meant enduring pain while still moving, still hunting, still surviving. And survive they did. The fossil record is littered with Cro-Magnon remains that show signs of catastrophic trauma. Fractured skulls, fused vertebrae, signs of infection, and long-healed wounds. These people did not fear anything the world could throw at them. At the time, life expectancy was short. Many likely died before age 40. But that number hides what mattered: resilience. Their bodies weren't just athletic, they were engineered by nature for combat, recovery, and raw survival. In one of Earth's most unforgiving habitats. We're not talking just cold here. Predators were a danger, but food sources as well. Mammoths, bison, and so on were everything but easy kills. Early anatomists were so stunned by these proportions that they initially thought crowds were a separate species of human altogether. It took decades of comparative analysis to realize that they were just us, but built different. Just us pushed to our biological extreme. But Cro-Magnons didn't just rely on brute strength. If they did, it wouldn't have been enough anyway. They brought with them a level of tactical and technological mastery that gave them a lethal edge. Their toolkits were engineered, diversified, and regionally optimized. Archaeologists classify their primary cultural complex as the Aryan nation, dating from 43,000 to 3,000 years ago. Though subsequent traditions like the Gravian, Silurian, and Magdalenian would evolve in overlapping regions. These cultures are defined by increasingly sophisticated hunting weapons, including retouched blades, end scrapers, and burns, narrow chiseling tools, possibly used for carving bone, antler, and wood. Their weapons went beyond what had been seen before in human history. Evidence from sites like Aubry, Castanet, France, and Castini, Russia, confirms widespread use of spear throwers, which leveraged the principle of angular momentum to launch projectiles at far greater speeds and distances than by hand. The earliest atlas date to around 30,000 years ago, but biomechanical models suggest such weapons may have roots in even earlier Cro-Magnon communities. This gave them an advantage over Neanderthals, who appear to have relied predominantly on thrusting spears. In 2019, studies published in scientific reports used impact simulations to demonstrate that Neanderthal weaponry was effective only at close range within 2 to 3 m, which is kind of the dead zone when hunting any large game of that period. Cro-Magnon ranged weapons, by contrast, could reliably strike prey on enemies up to 20 men away, changing the calculus of confrontation entirely. Injury patterns support this. Neanderthal remains show a high incidence of trauma to the upper body, consistent with dangerous close quarters hunting. Cro-Magnons, though, show a broader range of impact sites, consistent with ambush hunting from a distance. Their prey also reflects ambition. Isotopic analysis from bones. Isotopic analysis of bones from Cro-Magnon camps, especially in regions like Donny, Western Czech Republic, indicates diets rich in large herbivores. Horse, red deer, bison, and mammoth, with occasional consumption of rhinoceros and cave bear. Yes, you heard that right, they hunted bears. These weren't just random kills. In places like Pavlov and La Côte de Saint-Bad, kill sites show signs of strategic planning, mass drives into ravines, coordinated traps, and sequential butchering. Even more revealing, the use of composite tools. Residue analysis from sites like Goyet, Belgium, and Sibiu Cave, South Africa, shows early signs of adhesive like plant resin mixed with orsa or beeswax, creating hafted spears with stone tips. Early versions of modular replaceable weaponry. These aren't survival acts, they're engineering solutions. In the hands of a Cro-Magnon, a hunting spear wasn't just a stick with a rock. It was a calibrated weapon, pressure flicked to perfection, optimized for puncture, weight balance, and reload speed. In the battlefield, most likely was in limited animals. Some of the earliest forensic evidence of interhuman violence appears in Cro-Magnon remains. Cranial fractures, embedded weapon points, and deep thoracic wounds with trajectories indicative of interpersonal combat. The Cro-Magnon 2 skull, for example, bears a healed yet fatal blunt force injury consistent with a deliberate human strike. At Goyet, human bones show signs of butchering, cut marks, marrow extraction, and intentional deflaying performed with the same precision as on game animals. And they weren't just capable hunters, they were also coordinated, resourceful, and lethally efficient. The combination of muscle endurance, distance weapons, and advanced planing made Cro-Magnon the closest thing to a special operations force the place the scene had ever seen. And in a landscape of megafauna and rival hominins that changed everything. The fossil record rarely speaks loudly. In most cases, scientists need thorough examinations and experiments to make them talk. But not here. Beneath limestone overhangs and deep within cave chambers it screams. At Goyet Cave in Belgium, researchers uncovered an extraordinary and deeply unsettling layer of remains dating to approximately 40,000 to 30,000 years ago. Mixed among the bones of horses and reindeer were dozens of human fragments, skulls, femurs, mandibles, all showing the unmistakable marks of deliberate butchery, cut marks at tendon attachment points, percussion fractures used to crack open long bones, scraped jawbones cleaned of soft tissue. In short, textbook carcass processing, except it's human carcasses we're talking about. Among the victims were adults and children. A 2015 study published in Scientific Reports analyzed these remains and concluded that they had undergone the same sequence of treatment as animal prey: skinning, dismemberment, deflissing, and marrow extraction. Whether for sustenance or ritual, the humans who left these remains behind had crossed the line. The ultimate taboo of modern societies, turning their tools not just on the wild but on their own kind. And they may not have stopped it themselves. In La Faris, France, and La Predel, researchers found Neanderthal remains that bore strangely familiar marks. Slicing grooves along the jaw, peeling of muscle from limb bones, crushed crania. At Grot, Dunlithic tools and mammalian bone fragments lay side by side with broken Neanderthal remains, again showing signs of intentional cutting and processing. One Neanderthal rib in particular, analyzed at Le Rocher de Villeneuve, showed a clean puncture wound that had pierced the chest cavity, consistent with a stone-tipped projectile. Crucially, the angle and depth of penetration suggested a ranged strike, not a thrust, meaning it was probably killed from afar. Neanderthals, to our knowledge, did not use ranged weapons. Only Cro-Magnons were capable of such a thing, at least according to investigations and sites discovered so far. A 2020 study in Nature, Ecology and Evolution reinforced this interpretation, concluding that weapon delivery method can be reliably inferred from the wound morphology. The evidence points to a weapon thrown with significant kinetic energy, likely a spear or javelin used to kill a Neanderthal at range. If so, it may be one of the earliest known instances of one human species lethally targeting another with purpose-built tools. We know nothing about their motives, but there's a few reasons it could be plausible: territorial, defense, a clash over resources, and ambush, retaliation, and so on. What is clear is that it was not an isolated event. Multiple Neanderthal sites across Europe, particularly those with late surviving individuals, contain damage patterns consistent with trauma caused by human-made weapons. And then there's the most macabre find: skull cuffs. Ed Gein would most likely be proud of them. At G's Cave in Somerset, England, 3 human crania were discovered bearing clean, symmetrical modifications. The faces and cranial vaults had been removed, the edges smoothed, the interiors cleaned. Experimental archaeology has shown that this requires a deliberate multi-stage process involving at least 6 distinct cuts. Radioarbon dating places them at 14,700 years ago, still within the cultural horizon of Cro-Magnon-descended populations. These weren't random acts of desperation, they were methodical, intentional, possibly symbolic. Anthropologists remain divided on the motives. Some interpret these findings as survival cannibalism during periods of famine, or environmental stress, especially during Heinrich events, sudden cold snaps that disrupted food chains across Europe. Others suggest ritual diffing, ancestor worship, or trophy taking. None excludes any of the others. But whatever the motive, the outcome remains: humans have weaponized not just technology, but each other, following suit to a long tradition started by Homo ancestor and passed down since then. They didn't just outcompete each other, they actively hunted and killed, and at least sometimes they ate. Cro-Magnons weren't only strong, they were the very definition of the expression having both brain and brawn. Their legacy isn't treasured in shattered bones or spear points, it's carved into ivory, paved on walls, and etched into antler and stone. For all their brute power, these early humans also left behind a cultural signature unlike anything seen before. Their brains were large, very large. The average Cro-Magnon cranial capacity was around 1.5 and 14.7, significantly larger than today's global average of 1350 cm. That puts them on par with Neanderthals, but with a different architecture. Cro-Magnon brains had expanded frontal and occipital lobes, regions associated with executive planning, memory, and spatial reasoning. Their parietal lobes, the area tied to abstract thought and tool use, were also notably developed. But cognition doesn't fossilize, unfortunately. What does it? What they made with across Europe. Cro-Magnon populations developed at least 5 major cultural traditions. Argnian, Gravian, Celotrian, Epigravidian, and Magdalenian each brought innovations in tomb, but also in art, ornation, and domestic life. The first unambiguous figurative cave art appears around 37,000 years ago, during the Aurignacian period at Chauvet Cave in France. Artists used red ochre and charcoal to render lions, yes, in Europe, rhinos, mammoths, and composite creatures deep inside cavern walls. Far beyond the reach of sunlight, many of the drawings are anatomically correct with attention to motion perspective, and even shading. These weren't idle doodles, they were expressions of a symbolic mind, a mind capable of narrative abstraction and imagination. And it didn't stop at walls. At sites like Hohlfels, Germany, and Doli Vanici, Czech Republic, Cro-Magnon crafted figurines, including the now famous Venus statues, stylized female forms, often exaggerated, carved from mammoth ivory or limestone. The most famous, the Venus of Willendorf, is over 9,000 years old. The purpose of these figures is still debated: fertility, ancestral tokens, spiritual totems. But what's certain is that they were intentionally shaped, often carried, and sometimes buried. They meant something. Thousands of shell beads, perforated teeth, ivory pendants, and decorated fragments have been found across Cro-Magnon settlements, often in burial context. At Sun here, a grave dated to about 34,000 years ago held 2 children adorned with 13,000 ivory beads. A painstaking task estimated to have taken hundreds of hours of labor. Such investment hints at social structure, status, inheritance, and community. Cro-Magnon also made music. The earliest known flutes discovered in Hohlfels and Gas and Cluster date back to over 40,000 years ago. Carved from bird bones and mammoth tusk, they produce pentatonic scales, a structure used in global music today. From a neurological standpoint, this is striking. Music, rhythm, and coordinated sound production engage multiple brain regions simultaneously: frontal, temporal, motor, and limbic. Their ability to play music implies not just abstract cognition, but emotionally complex social behavior. What all of this reveals is simple and yet profound. Cro-Magnons weren't just adapting to survive. They were adapting to express especially the abstract. They could imagine animals that didn't exist. They could mark identity with symbols. They could bury their dead and decorate their homes. They had a concept of beauty, of memory, of belonging. In a world defined by frost and violence, they created color, sound, and meaning. And in doing so, they left behind something no predator ever could: a story. But with all that being said and done, Cro-Magnons still went extinct. But they didn't vanish overnight. Instead, they faded, absorbed, reshaped, and diluted across time. Their disappearance wasn't an end, it was an inheritance. By around 13,000 years ago, the last glacial maximum had released its grip. Temperatures across Europe began to rise rapidly, marking the end of the Pleine. The continent transformed. Permafrost gave way to tundra, which in turn became forests. Environments shifted, so did the people. As they adapted to the cold, they adapted to the heat. The large-bodied Cro-Magnon men built optimized for Ice Age endurance, strength, and thermoregulation began to win. Their once prominent robustness, especially in the limbs, nose, and jaws, diminished across generations. It was adaptive selection in action. As the environment warmed, the selective pressures that once formed massive muscle mass and dense bones began to reverse. Smaller bodies lost less water, consumed fewer calories, and were better suited to navigate forested terrain. Genetic studies confirm this shift, while mitochondrial DNA lineages from Cro-Magnon populations persist in modern Europeans. Especially in haplogroups like UNH, the high proportion of Ice Age-specific traits, including their unusual skeletal robustness, gradually diminished after 1000 BC, but not all of them disappeared at once. Later Magdalenian settlements dating between 17,000 and 12,000 years ago show a rich continuation of Cro-Magnon cultural elements: advanced tools, elaborate carvings, and organized camps. These groups hunted reindeer, red deer, and ibex, moving seasonally and often maintaining complex trade routes across hundreds of kilometers. Their populations, however, remained relatively small, often in isolated bands of 20 to 40 individuals. By the time agriculture arrived in Europe around 8,000 years ago, these final Cro-Magnon-descended hunter-gatherers had already been largely integrated into broader Homo sapiens lineages. Genetic studies, including those using ancient autosomal DNA, show that modern Europeans descend from a mosaic of Paleolithic foragers, Neolithic farmers, and later Bronze Age steppe migrants. The distant Cro-Magnon genome, once dominant across Ice Age Europe, now survives only in fragments. But their echo is unmistakable. Their tools, traditions, and genes flowed into successive populations. We see it in the burials of Mesolithic coastal foragers, in the bone flutes of early agriculturalists, in the skull shapes of certain early Neolithic remains. They became the substrate, the base layer on which later societies were built. Cro-Magnons didn't really go extinct. They were transformed by time, climate, and most of all contact with other human populations. Their name may have faded from scientific taxonomy, but their blood still pulses in millions of living people. Their ideas, art, burial, music, memory survived the ice. Their bodies disappeared, but their story didn't. We often imagine prehistory as a battleground between man and beast, humans huddling against the cold while saber-tooths and mammoths roam the wild. But Cro-Magnon Europe offers a more complicated picture, because the most dangerous thing walking the Ice Age landscape wasn't always an animal. Sometimes it was another human, and actually you can feel it in your very bones. If you've ever been somewhere alone, like a forest somewhere deep, where you know no one can lend you a hand. In those times, crossing the path of someone you don't know is a source of stress more than a source of relief. Most of us have felt that tension, suspicion, Even maybe this feeling comes from times hominins were actually taking down each other, and being isolated meant being already dead. The forensic record is blunt at multiple Upper Paleolithic sites. Human remains show clear signs of interpersonal violence: skull fractures, stab wounds, crushed vertebrae, all inflicted by weapons designed for killing. One adult male found at the site of L'Île-Bacard at France bore a deep puncture wound to the face, likely caused by a stone spear or flint blade. At Goyette, 3 individuals were processed after death with a level of anatomical knowledge that matched what was done to butchered animals: skin removed, muscles peeled, back marrow extracted. This wasn't isolated madness, it was patterned, practiced, and widespread violence. Refined, you'd say. In some cases, death was quick: a spear to the rib cage or a blow to the head. In others, it was drawn out. Cranial analysis from Crow Mag 2 showed identified signs of intracranial bleeding and brain hematosis, fatal in the absence of any form of treatment. Most likely, what he died from was a consequence of the blunt force trauma he suffered, and the locations of these injuries matter. Many are focused on the skull of the face or the upper torso, precisely the areas targeted in deliberate attacks. Combined with the sophistication of their weapons, this suggests premeditation, not accident. In the very Ice Age gave plenty of motives for such behaviors: land, food, mating rights, water sources, revenge. In small populations, the death of a single individual could shift power, change alliances, or eliminate a rival line. Tensions may have flared over seasonal hunting territories or access to key resources like flint or salt. With no borders, no laws, and no written language to mediate conflict, disputes often ended at the point of a spear. But violence didn't always stop at killing. As mentioned earlier, bodies were as good a resource as any other: flesh for eating, bones for carving, tools, cups, and so on. Some researchers interpret this as survival cannibalism, others see signs of symbolic warfare, acts of dominance, desecration, or ancestral ritual in other cases. In either case, it shows this much: Cro-Magnons, for all their intelligence and creativity, were not morally sanitized versions of us. The theory of philosophers stating men at heart are good when their primal environment is far from the truth, capable of compassion and murder, music and mutilation, trade and war. The same minds that mapped the stars could plot revenge. Prehistory didn't cleanse humanity of its darkness. It revealed its roots. We didn't become violent with civilization. Civilization grew from creatures who already were. And in that frozen crucible, long before cities and cages, something familiar was born. Not in art or speech or tools, but in the decision to kill and the choice to remember it. Their bones are buried, their names lost, but Cro-Magnons never fully disappeared. Genetically, they're still here. Modern Europeans carry fragments of their DNA tangled with that of Neanderthals. Later farmers from Anatolia and Bronze Age migrants from the steppe. The early Europeans we now call Cro-Magnon were not a separate species, but the first wave of Homo sapiens to gain a foothold in Ice Age Europe, and that foothold held in sites like Kinki 14 in Russia and Dreux de Bachon in Switzerland. Genetic sequencing has revealed direct ancestral lines connecting these Ice Age humans to modern populations. Some lineages persisted for millennia, others vanished as later groups arrived and intermixed. But no major European genome today is untouched by them. Their faces too linger. Cranial reconstructions of Cro-Magnon individuals show a strange familiarity: broad foreheads, pronounced chines. Large jaws, features we now describe as archaic, were once dominant. Over time, with warmer climates and shifting diets, these traits softened, but some still echo. And cheekbones in brow lines and jaw angles scattered across the continent. Their descendants built Neolithic camps, raised Neolithic settlements and later cities, and even as their skeletons changed, parts of their cognitive architecture endured. The artistic traditions they initiated, the ochre pigments, bone flutes, abstract carvings, resurfaced again and again, adapted to new gods, new symbols, new tools. The transition was gradual, the Magdalenian culture, active between 17,000 and 12,000 years ago, marks the final archaeological horizon where Cro-Magnon traits are still distinct. After this point, distinctions blur, new groups moved in, climate-shifted forests grew. But before their lines thinned, Cro-Magnon populations had expanded rapidly. From a few thousand pioneers, their numbers grew until Ice Age Europe supported an estimated 70,000 individuals. A demographic leap that likely overwhelmed the remaining Neanderthal pockets, reshaped ecosystems, and laid the foundation for all later European history. They didn't leave monuments, they didn't leave writing. What they left was momentum. Each hunt, each hearth, each carved figure added weight to a cultural snowball that wouldn't stop rolling. When later humans mapped stars, raised cathedrals, or etched names into coins, they were using a symbolic toolkit first sharpened in mammoth bone huts under a glacial sky. Cro-Magnons didn't vanish, they became the substratum of Europe, its first voice, its first image makers, its first architects of story. The traces run through us, not in myth, in blood. We call them Cro-Magnon, but that was never their name. They didn't think of themselves as ancient, or transitional, or part of some evolutionary arc. They were simply people living through winter, raising children, shaping stone, boiling marrow, burying their dead. No fanfare, no idea they'd be studied 30 years later by strangers with satellite maps in gene sequences. But without them there is no us. They crossed ice sheets, hunted giants, and adapted to a world that could kill you for standing still. They made art before alphabets, scheduled migrations without clocks, and mapped terrain in their minds. They carried stories long before they had language for them, and in doing so they changed what it meant to be human, not with a revolution, but with accumulation, tool by tool, step by step, thought by thought. They weren't the first to live, they weren't the last to die, but they were the ones who held long enough for memory to take root and spread. So when you look in the mirror, you're not seeing a break in the chain. You're seeing its most recent link, because Cro-Magnons didn't disappear, they're still here. You're one of them. Thanks for watching. If this journey through deep time sparked something in you, a question, a curiosity, maybe even a sense of wonder, don't let it end here. Subscribe for more stories from the edge of extinction and the roots of who we are. Like the video if it reframed how you see our species. Share it with someone who's ever looked at the stars and wondered where it all began. And drop a comment what part of this story stayed with you the most. This channel grows with your support, your thoughts, your clicks, your curiosity. They help these stories echo further. Thanks for being part of that. Till next video, keep listening to the echoes.